The Thanksgiving table looked like something from a holiday magazine. Every plate was perfectly arranged, candles flickered across the center, and the smell of roasted turkey filled the house. My relatives laughed as they settled into their seats, talking about old memories and passing food around before dinner had even started. I stood quietly near the dining room doorway waiting for someone to tell me where I should sit. Then my mother reached for the last empty chair. Instead of pulling it toward the table, she dragged it across the floor and pushed it against the wall. The room fell strangely quiet as she looked straight at me with a cold smile. "No seat for disappointments," she said. A few relatives laughed awkwardly. Others looked down at their plates as if they hadn't heard her. My older brother Jace simply shrugged like this was nothing unusual. My father, Clint, stared at his glass without saying a single word. Not one person asked my mother to stop. I couldn't move for several seconds. My face burned with embarrassment while everyone avoided looking at me. I had never felt so unwanted in my own home. Without saying anything, I picked up my coat from the hallway. As I reached the front door, my mother's voice followed me one last time. "Don't come back until you're finally willing to help this family for once." I paused for only a moment before walking outside. The cold air hit my face, but somehow it hurt less than the words I had just heard. At that moment, I believed I had lost everything. I didn't know that leaving that house would become the turning point that changed my life forever. Before we dive into it, tell me in the comments where you're from. I love seeing the different places people tune in from. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss more stories like this. Now stick with me because what happened after I walked away from that Thanksgiving table completely changed my life. A few weeks earlier, life had looked very different. I was 19 years old, attending community college and working hard to save every dollar I could. My dream was to transfer to a university the following year, and I carefully planned every expense. While I focused on building my future, I had no idea my father had been losing huge amounts of money through gambling. Hidden behind forced smiles and quiet excuses, he was becoming more desperate every day, searching for a way to escape the mess he had created. Looking back, I can see the change started weeks before Thanksgiving. At the time, I thought my parents were simply trying to be nicer. My father, Clint, suddenly began asking about my classes and my plans for transferring to a university. He even offered to drive me to work a few times, something he had never done before. My mother, Pam, stopped criticizing every little thing I did and started telling me how proud she was that I had always been responsible with money. It felt strange, but I wanted to believe things were finally getting better. Then my mother started talking about family sacrifices. Almost every conversation ended with the same message. She would remind me that families helped each other no matter what. She said everyone had to give something when times became difficult. Whenever I asked what she meant, she smiled and changed the subject. A few days later, my parents asked me to sit down with them after dinner. My brother Jace was already waiting at the table with a serious expression. My father placed a folder in front of me and gently pushed it across the table. "We just need your signature," he said. "It's only temporary." I opened the folder and saw several legal documents filled with small print. My mother quickly explained that they only needed short-term access to my college savings because the family was dealing with unexpected financial problems. She promised every dollar would be returned before I needed it. Something about the situation didn't feel right. Instead of signing, I slowly read every page. The more I read, the tighter my chest became. The papers did not give my parents temporary access at all. They transferred complete control of my account to them. Once I signed, they would have the legal right to use every cent without asking me again. I looked up and quietly asked why the papers said something completely different from what they had told me. The room instantly changed. My mother's warm smile disappeared. She folded her arms and accused me of acting like a stranger instead of a daughter. She said they had spent years feeding me, raising me, and keeping a roof over my head. According to her, signing one piece of paper should not have been such a difficult decision. I calmly closed the folder and slid it back across the table. "I'm not signing this," I said. My father let out a long sigh but still avoided answering my questions. Before he could speak, Jace leaned forward and shook his head. "Real family doesn't sit around reading contracts," he said. "If mom and dad need help, you help them. You don't treat them like criminals." His words stung, but they also made something clear. Nobody cared what the papers actually said. They only cared that I obeyed without asking questions. I stood up, picked up my backpack, and quietly walked to my room. My hands were shaking, but my decision never changed. I would not hand over the money I had spent years saving. From that night on, everything inside the house shifted. The smiles disappeared, conversations became cold, and every glance reminded me that refusing to sign had turned me into the enemy under my own family's roof. Thanksgiving morning began with silence instead of celebration. I woke up expecting another tense day, but I never imagined it would end with me losing my home. My mother was already angry before sunrise, slamming cabinet doors and muttering to herself. My father sat at the kitchen table staring at his phone. It rang over and over, but he kept rejecting every call without saying a word. I knew something was wrong, but no one explained anything to me. A few minutes later, my mother marched into my bedroom carrying a large black trash bag. Without warning, she started pulling my clothes from the closet and tossing them inside. Shirts, jeans, shoes, and jackets disappeared into the bag as if they meant nothing. "What are you doing?" I asked, completely stunned. "You've made your choice," she replied without looking at me. "Now you can leave." I begged her to stop, but she ignored every word. She zipped the bag closed, shoved it into my hands, and pointed toward the front door. My father never moved from his chair. He heard everything but kept his eyes on the table. His phone continued vibrating every few minutes. I later realized those endless calls were from creditors demanding money he didn't have. They believed taking my savings would solve all their problems, and when I refused, I became the problem instead. "You don't live here anymore," my mother said coldly. "Maybe when you're ready to help this family you can come back." The front door closed behind me before I had time to process what had happened. The November air was freezing. I stood in the driveway holding one trash bag that contained everything I owned. My hands were shaking, though I couldn't tell if it was from the cold or the shock. As the morning passed, relatives began arriving for Thanksgiving dinner. Cars filled the driveway while people carried pies, flowers, and covered dishes toward the house. Several of them looked directly at me standing outside. A few frowned with curiosity, but none of them stopped to ask why I wasn't inside. They simply walked past me as though I belonged out there. That hurt almost as much as being thrown out. I kept telling myself this couldn't be real. Just days earlier I had been worrying about homework, exams, and transferring to a university. Now I didn't even know where I would sleep that night. While I stood there trying not to cry, my neighbor Mara Ellis stepped onto her front porch. She had lived next door for years and always greeted me with a smile whenever we crossed paths. She looked from me to the trash bag and then toward my parents' house. She didn't ask uncomfortable questions or pretend everything was normal. Instead, she quietly walked over and said, "You shouldn't be standing out here in this weather." I didn't have the strength to argue. I followed her across the yard, still carrying the bag with my belongings. Later, while searching through it for a clean sweater, something slipped from between my folded clothes. It was an unopened Thanksgiving card addressed in my late grandfather Ellis Reed's familiar handwriting. It had arrived shortly before he passed away, but I had never been able to bring myself to open it. Holding that envelope in my hands, I had no idea it contained the first piece of a truth that would change everything. For several minutes I simply stared at the envelope in my hands. Seeing my grandfather's familiar handwriting brought back memories I had tried to push aside after losing him. I had carried that card around for months without opening it because I wasn't ready to face another reminder that he was gone. Now, with nowhere else to turn, I carefully broke the seal. Inside was a Thanksgiving card with a folded handwritten letter. The first few lines made my heart race. "My dear Bria, if you're reading this, I'm afraid the day I worried about has finally arrived. Your parents have shown you who they truly are. As painful as that is, you must believe what you've seen." I read those words again, hardly believing them. My grandfather had written the letter long before everything happened. Somehow he had expected this moment. As I continued reading, a small metal key slipped from the folded pages and landed in my lap. Taped beside it was a note with the name and address of a local bank. My grandfather had written clear instructions telling me to visit the bank, show my identification, and ask for a safety deposit box that had been waiting in my name. Then I reached one sentence that changed everything. "This was never your college fund." That was only the first layer. I froze. I didn't understand what he meant. As far as I knew, my college savings account was the only money connected to my future. Why would he call it the first layer? What else had he been talking about? I turned the letter over several times, hoping I had missed another explanation, but there was nothing more except his signature and a reminder to trust the instructions exactly as he had written them. That night I barely slept. My mind raced with questions that had no answers. Every possibility seemed impossible. I kept thinking about my parents' sudden interest in my savings, the papers they wanted me to sign, and the strange confidence my grandfather had shown in his letter. When morning arrived, I knew I had to follow his instructions. After breakfast, Maura offered to drive me to the bank. Neither of us spoke much during the trip. I held the key tightly in my hand the entire way, wondering what waited behind a locked box that had remained untouched for years. Inside the bank, I explained why I had come and handed over my identification. The manager carefully checked my information before looking at the records on his computer. His expression became serious and he politely asked me to follow him. We walked through a secure hallway until we reached the vault. He unlocked one door then another before stopping in front of a small safety deposit box. After comparing the number with his records, he nodded and stepped aside so I could use the key my grandfather had left for me. The lock clicked open. Inside were several neatly arranged envelopes, sealed documents, financial records, and personal letters organized with incredible care. Everything looked as though my grandfather had prepared it knowing someone would eventually open it. Resting on top of the stack was one final envelope. Across the front, in his unmistakable handwriting, were the words, "Read this before trusting anyone." At that moment, I realized my grandfather hadn't simply left me a letter. He had left me a plan. With trembling hands, I opened the envelope lying on top of the documents. My grandfather's handwriting filled several pages. Every sentence felt as though he were sitting beside me, speaking directly to me one last time. He explained that none of what I was about to discover had happened by accident. For years he had quietly watched my father's gambling grow worse. At first the losses were small, but they became larger until borrowing money turned into a habit. Whenever my father promised he had changed, the same pattern returned a few months later. My grandfather wanted to believe him, but he trusted actions more than promises. The next pages contained copies of records that shocked me. My parents had borrowed money from him many times. Each request came with a different story. Sometimes they claimed medical bills had piled up. Other times they said they needed help paying household expenses or supporting my education. My grandfather had carefully written notes beside every payment, explaining what they had told him and what he later discovered to be true. The lies stretched back years. There were also letters showing that my parents had repeatedly asked him to rewrite his estate plans. They insisted everything should be left directly to them because they knew what was best for the family. Every request had been refused. My grandfather had documented each conversation, including the dates and the reasons he believed they could not be trusted with his assets. As I continued reading, I finally understood why he had been so careful. He had never intended to leave everything in their hands. Instead, he worked with lawyers to place most of what he owned into legally protected trusts. Those trusts could not be touched by anyone except me, and only after I turned 19. Until then, everything remained safely protected exactly as he had planned. Then I found the paperwork connected to my college savings. The account my parents had tried so desperately to control was never theirs in the first place. It wasn't even an ordinary college fund. It served as a small part of a much larger financial plan my grandfather had created years earlier. The documents described investment accounts, income from rental properties, and long-term savings that had quietly grown over time. Together they were worth far more than I had ever imagined. My college account was simply the visible portion. The rest had remained hidden behind legal protections that prevented anyone from taking advantage of them. Suddenly everything made sense. My parents hadn't become interested in my future because they cared about my education. They wanted access to something they believed would solve their financial problems. They just didn't know the full truth. Near the end of the file, my grandfather left one final message. "If you're reading this, it means I was right to prepare for this day. I prayed I would be wrong, but I could not ignore what I saw. My greatest responsibility was not leaving you money. It was making sure nobody could take your future away." I lowered the papers and sat in complete silence. For the first time since being forced out of my home, I understood why he had planned everything so carefully. He hadn't expected strangers to hurt me. He had believed I would one day need protection from my own parents, and he had made sure that protection was already waiting long before I knew I needed it. The bank manager carefully organized the documents before looking at me. He said my grandfather had expected I might need legal guidance once I learned the truth. Then he handed me a business card. The attorney who helped prepare these trusts already knows the details, he said. His name is Noah Pike. The following afternoon I sat across from Noah in his office with every document spread across the table. He read each page slowly, stopping often to compare records and legal filings. The more he examined everything, the clearer the picture became. My grandfather had built strong legal protections around every part of the trust. Nothing had been left to chance. Noah opened another file and showed me something I had never expected to see. After my grandfather passed away, my parents had tried several times to gain access to the trust. Each request had been formally submitted and reviewed. Every single one had been denied because they had no legal authority over the assets. There were letters explaining the decisions, copies of rejected applications, and official notices informing them that the trust could only be accessed according to my grandfather's instructions. So they already knew they couldn't touch it, I said quietly. Noah nodded. They've known for quite some time. That single sentence answered questions I had been asking myself for weeks. Their sudden kindness, the family talks, and the papers they wanted me to sign had never been about helping me. They were searching for another way around the legal barriers they couldn't break. Not long after leaving the office, my phone started ringing. It was my mother. I didn't answer. She called again. Then again. Soon voicemail notifications filled my phone. Her messages sounded completely different from the woman who had thrown me out of the house. She cried while saying she loved me. She insisted everything had been a misunderstanding. She claimed they only wanted to protect my future and begged me to come home so the family could talk. A few hours later, my father left a message of his own. His voice sounded exhausted. He admitted he had made mistakes and promised he would stop gambling. He said he wanted another chance to fix everything before it was too late. Then my brother Jace called. He blamed all the fighting on stress. According to him, everyone had been under pressure and people sometimes said things they didn't mean. He kept repeating that families should forgive each other instead of holding on to anger. Listening to those messages, I almost started doubting myself again. Maybe they really had changed. Maybe I was being too harsh. The next morning I shared the voicemails with Noah. After listening carefully, he placed his phone on the desk and looked directly at me. The timing tells you everything, he said. None of these calls came before you visited the bank. They came after they realized they could lose access forever. They're reacting to what they can't control, not to how they treated you. His words stayed with me long after I left his office. For years, guilt had followed me everywhere. I constantly wondered if I wasn't doing enough, giving enough, or sacrificing enough. Now for the first time I saw those feelings for what they really were. They hadn't been created by love. They had been created by years of manipulation. And once I finally recognized that truth, the guilt began to disappear, replaced by a clarity I had never felt before. Several weeks passed before my parents contacted me again. This time the message sounded different. They wanted the whole family to get together and put the past behind us. According to my mother, Thanksgiving had been filled with misunderstandings, and everyone deserved a chance to make peace before Christmas. I knew this gathering wasn't really about forgiveness. It was about control. Even so, I agreed to attend. I wasn't walking into that house alone. Noah came with me, along with the trust administrator who had managed my grandfather's estate exactly as he instructed. Every important document was neatly organized inside a briefcase. The moment I stepped through the front door, every conversation stopped. My relatives looked at me with curiosity. Some offered polite smiles while others simply watched without saying a word. My parents acted as though nothing unusual had happened. After everyone settled into the living room, my mother stood and cleared her throat. She looked around the room with tears in her eyes. "I don't know why Bria abandoned us," she said. "We were struggling, and instead of standing beside her family, she walked away when we needed her the most." Several relatives nodded. A few looked at me with disappointment. Before anyone could respond, Noah calmly stood up. "I believe everyone should hear the complete story," he said. He placed several official documents on the table where everyone could see them. One by one he explained exactly how my grandfather had arranged his estate years before his death. He showed the trust agreements, legal records and written instructions proving that everything had been carefully protected according to my grandfather's wishes. Then he unfolded a handwritten letter. It was from my grandfather. In that letter he explained why he had created the trust. He described his concerns about my father's gambling, repeated financial problems, and the pressure he feared I would someday face. The room became completely silent. Noah continued presenting records showing that my parents had tried multiple times to gain access to the trust after my grandfather passed away. Every request had been rejected because they had no legal right to control those assets. He also explained that the papers they wanted me to sign would have transferred authority over my protected account to them. Gasps spread through the room. For the first time, everyone understood why I had refused. My father tried to interrupt several times, insisting there had been mistakes and misunderstandings, but the financial records spoke for themselves. Notices from banks, unpaid debts, and official documents revealed how serious his gambling losses had become. No explanation could erase the evidence. The relatives who had once blamed me slowly turned toward my parents instead. Questions filled the room. When did this start? Why didn't you tell anyone? You really asked her to sign those papers? No one asked me why I had left anymore. They already knew. My mother struggled to answer as every excuse fell apart under the weight of the documents sitting on the table. My father lowered his head without saying another word. The same people who had laughed while I stood without a chair on Thanksgiving now couldn't even meet my eyes. Noah quietly gathered the papers after everyone had seen them. There was nothing else to prove. The truth had finally reached the people who needed to hear it, and the family that once judged me in silence now sat together in complete silence for an entirely different reason. After that family gathering, everything changed. The truth was no longer hidden behind excuses or false stories. My parents could no longer blame me for the problems they had created because everyone knew what had really happened. My father's financial situation became impossible to ignore. The creditors who had spent months calling him continued demanding payment. Letters arrived almost every week and there was no protected account left for him to chase. The money he believed would solve everything had never belonged to him and there was no legal way to reach it. For years he had hoped someone else would rescue him from the consequences of his gambling. Now he had to face those consequences himself. My mother also discovered that appearances could only hide the truth for so long. She had always taken pride in showing off expensive jewelry, designer handbags, and furniture she loved talking about whenever guests visited. One by one those things disappeared. Some were sold to help cover unpaid bills. Others went to settle debts that could no longer be delayed. The lifestyle she had worked so hard to display slowly disappeared, replaced by the reality she had spent years trying to avoid. Jace struggled with everything he had learned. Growing up, he had believed every story our parents told him. He honestly thought I was selfish because that was what he had heard for years. After seeing the documents and learning the truth, he realized how much had been hidden from him. One afternoon he called to apologize. He admitted he should have listened instead of judging me. He couldn't change the past, but he accepted that our parents had manipulated both of us in different ways. Not long afterward he moved out and started building a life on his own. As for me, I finally focused on the future instead of constantly defending myself. My grandfather had worked so hard to protect my education, and I refused to let his efforts go to waste. I completed my transfer to the university I had dreamed about for years and paid my tuition through the trust exactly as he intended. Every class reminded me why he had believed in me even when I struggled to believe in myself. There was one more thing I wanted to do. When I had nowhere to go, Mara opened her door without asking for anything in return. She gave me warmth, safety, and dignity on the worst day of my life. Her home had needed repairs for years, but she always placed other people's needs before her own. Using a small portion of the trust, I arranged to have the roof repaired, the broken porch rebuilt, and several other problems fixed around the house. She tried to refuse at first, but I simply smiled. "You helped me when I had nothing," I told her. "Please let me do this." She hugged me with tears in her eyes. As my life slowly moved forward, my parents were left to deal with the choices they had made. No hidden money appeared to save them. No last-minute miracle erased the damage. For the first time, they had to accept responsibility without expecting someone else to sacrifice their future. Meanwhile, I was finally building the future my grandfather had always hoped I would have, one honest step at a time. A year passed faster than I ever expected. The pain of that Thanksgiving never completely disappeared, but it no longer controlled my life. So much had changed in 12 months that sometimes it felt like I was remembering someone else's story instead of my own. Christmas morning arrived quietly. I woke up in my own small home, a place that wasn't fancy or filled with expensive furniture, but every corner made me feel safe. For the first time in years, I wasn't worried about arguments, guilt, or pretending everything was fine. Peace had become the greatest comfort I could ask for. A Christmas tree stood beside the living room window, decorated with ornaments that had once belonged to my grandfather. Each one reminded me of holidays we had shared when I was younger. As I carefully hung the last ornament on the highest branch, I smiled through tears instead of sadness. His memory no longer brought only grief. It brought strength. Later that afternoon, I sat with a warm cup of coffee and unfolded the final letter he had placed inside the safety deposit box. I had read it many times over the past year, yet every sentence still carried the same meaning. He never wrote about money as though it were the most important thing. Instead, he wrote about character, honesty, and the importance of protecting my future without allowing fear to change the kind of person I wanted to become. As I finished reading, I finally understood something that had taken me an entire year to accept. The greatest gift my grandfather left me wasn't the trust. It wasn't the investments or the savings. It was knowing that at least one person believed in me so completely that he prepared for the day everyone else might turn against me. Even after he was gone, his love continued protecting me through every decision he had made. That realization meant more than anything sitting in a bank account. Just as I placed the letter back into its envelope, someone knocked on my front door. Waiting outside was a delivery driver holding a small package addressed to me. There was no return address. Inside I found another envelope along with a short note from Noah. He explained that my grandfather had instructed him to deliver this final letter only after I completed my first semester at the university. Alice wanted me to receive it only after I had proven to myself that I could build the life he always imagined for me. With tears in my eyes, I opened the envelope. His handwriting greeted me one last time. He congratulated me for continuing my education and reminded me that success was never measured by the size of an inheritance. According to him, true wealth came from having the freedom to make choices without fear, to help others without expecting anything in return, and to recognize the difference between kindness and allowing people to take advantage of it. His final words stayed with me long after I finished reading. He hoped I would always keep my heart open, but never hand my future to people who refused to value it. I carefully folded the letter and placed it beside the others. Outside, Christmas lights covered the neighborhood. Inside my little home, I finally felt something I hadn't experienced in a very long time. I felt completely at peace. The following Thanksgiving arrived with a feeling I never thought I would experience again. Instead of waking up with anxiety, I woke up excited to welcome people into my own home. The house wasn't large, but every room was filled with warmth, laughter, and the comforting smell of food cooking in the kitchen. This dinner wasn't about pretending to be a perfect family. It was about sharing a meal with people who had shown me genuine kindness. As I finished setting the table, I carefully placed a small card with each guest's name beside every plate. Mara smiled when she saw hers. Noah laughed and joked that he had never received a reserved seat at Thanksgiving before. Close friends and kind neighbors who had become part of my life over the past year slowly filled the house with conversation and happiness. This time no one had to wonder where they belonged. Every chair was waiting for someone. Before anyone sat down, I carried one final place setting to the table. Beside my own chair, I gently placed an old photograph of my grandfather, Alice Reed. The picture showed him wearing the same warm smile I remembered from childhood. I rested the frame against the empty plate and stood quietly for a moment. No words could fully express what he had given me. He hadn't simply protected my future with legal documents or financial planning. He had protected my hope. Long before I understood the battles waiting ahead, he had made sure I would never face them without a way forward. The room grew silent as everyone looked toward the photograph. Then we all took our seats. As dinner began, stories were shared, laughter filled the house, and for the first time in many years, Thanksgiving felt exactly as it should. There was no fear of saying the wrong thing, no pressure to earn a place at the table, and no conditions attached to anyone's love or acceptance. At that same moment across town, my parents were spending Thanksgiving in a very different way. The house that had once been filled with relatives had become painfully quiet. The people they had tried so hard to impress were no longer gathering around their table. The daughter they had pushed away wasn't missing because she had refused to help. She was gone because they had spent years treating her as though she never truly belonged. No amount of regret could erase that truth. As I looked around my own table, I realized every person there had chosen to be part of my life, just as I had chosen them. Those relationships had been built on honesty, respect, and kindness instead of guilt or obligation. I thought back to the moment my mother dragged my chair away and told me there was no seat for disappointments. At the time, those words had broken my heart. Now they no longer had any power over me. I finally understood what my grandfather had wanted me to discover all along. I was never the disappointment. I had simply been trying to find a place at the wrong table. Surrounded by people who truly cared, I smiled, gave thanks for the life I had rebuilt, and realized that my seat had been waiting for me all along.